Aviation is widely considered one of the safest modes of transportation. Today we're diving into the thrilling and at times perilous world of flying in the country Nepal. Despite its breathtaking terrain, Nepal has earned a reputation for having one of the most challenging aviation systems, with a staggering 44 deadly accidents since 1955. But as we prepare for our landing, stretch those legs and heed the call of the illuminated seatbelt sign. Let's soar into this riveting journey together. In this episode, we'll unravel the gripping tale of Yeti Airline Flight 691, a tragic incident that unfolded during the final approach to Pokhara International Airport. With footage captured from multiple angles, including from inside the aircraft, we invite you to relive the intensity of this unforgettable moment. So secure your belongings, folks, as we embark on this riveting journey together. Welcome to Destination Aviation. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. If this is your first episode, welcome to your first episode. For those tuning back in, thank you for always being our loyal listeners. I am your hostess with the mostest, as Beetlejuice would say. He is from last month, though. We were at a spooky season, and we were back into normal communication, which, you know what, does cover some spooky stuff here and there. I mean, that is kind of some of the theme of the show, so not saying October will be the only month we talk about that type of stuff. Definitely was fun to highlight for 30 days. As we talked about last time, I got no trick-or-treaters, so the candy was all mine. Does not help the waistline. I haven't thrown the CG off in the plane yet, so we're still nose high, tail a little bit lower, but not enough to cause an incident. We've actually had some decent fall flying weather here as of late, which is nice considering of the snow. As the last podcast, we had about an inch on the ground. That has now subsided. We're back to some grass, some blue skies, some light winds, perfect VFR type flying. So hopefully some of you out there are getting out and about. Or you know some people that you can go and take a ride with. Or just go down to your local airport and take an airplane ride. Some offer it. You can usually Google that, find it. It's a fun experience, especially if you have kids and stuff. You're looking for something to do on a weekend. So I definitely recommend checking out your local airport. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were surprised at how many actual airports there are around the U.S. So you can usually find one in your backyard, wherever you may reside. One thing that I wanted to talk about that I actually forgot about last week, and I'm sure some of you have seen it in the news, but this off-duty Alaska Airlines pilot that tried to shut down the engines of the aircraft in mid-flight. I actually was some friends that had sent me the original audio when it came out from ATC and the pilots, diverting, I believe it was to Portland, Oregon, from their departure point of Seattle. And the off-duty pilot was accused of trying to shut down the engines. He was deadheading, which, of course, the first thing that anybody says in this industry is, okay, well, that will probably be the end of allowing crew to be in the flight deck if they're deadheading in a jump seat. It's interesting as that continues to unfold. You know, he's been charged, I believe it's with 83 counts of attempted murder. He was on mushrooms and depressed, supposedly, from what he said, didn't realize what he was doing when he stood up and tried to shut down the engines. You know, quite honestly, something that I would buy. I know when it first happened, I questioned if that was his intention. Why wouldn't he just wait until he was flying his own aircraft rather than being in the jump seat? So there may be some truth behind him getting on some sort of illicit substance that caused him to not really understand what he was doing. Regardless, this has turned into now obviously a huge situation for this gentleman with 83 counts of attempted murder. And I saw that now 3 of the passengers on the flight are suing Alaska Airlines for emotional distress, which is interesting because I would assume from at least the audio that I heard, I know they had removed the individual, put him in the front of the plane landed fine, but unless you read the stories after the fact, I would be very curious if everybody on the plane knew that he actually attempted to shut down the engines more than there was just a commotion. But we are in a suing society. People sue for everything. So not a surprise to see that there are lawsuits out there, not necessarily discouraging what they went through. I'm just in my own mind thinking it through, how much did they actually know? I've been on a lot of commercial flights, and you very rarely know exactly what's going on all the time. You just know you might be diverting. We've all been there too, whether it's for weather or whatever. The situation would be a medical emergency. Speaking of which, Another interesting case that's out there, I don't know if everybody saw this, but the Delta Airlines pilot and the medical emergency situation that happened. So let's talk a little bit about that one. Both of these incidences are regarding around people that hold security clearances. In this case, someone who's actually a part of the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program, which authorizes flight crew members to use firearms to defend against criminal violence in the air or piracy, things of that nature. So you have someone cleared to be a part of that program. The other incident we're talking about with Alaska Airlines, a pilot, someone who's got a security credential. So I'm sure there's going to be scrutiny around security and TSA policies. That's usually what happens in these incidences. So I'm sure there'll be adjustments to both programs. If we don't see it up front, probably behind the scenes. But a former Delta Airlines co-pilot accused of threatening to shoot the plane's captain during a flight, and now he's facing felony charges. This happened in August of 2022. Jonathan Dunn was indicted on October 18th and charged with interfering with a flight crew. After a disagreement between the first officer, Dunn, and the pilot regarding a passenger with a medical issue and a possible diversion, supposedly second officer threatened to shoot the pilot if he diverted the aircraft to this location. So I have, looking around online about this, I don't know beyond that statement what the reasoning was. Maybe he just really needed to get where he had to go. I think we've all had people in our lives jokingly say, "I'll shoot you," at some point. Maybe not so much these days, but if you grew up in a certain timeline, it wasn't unheard of. Your friends would say that. Sounds like this was more threatening. It sounds like at least that's the way the pilot took it. And of course, with the charges here, he is no longer employed by Delta Airlines. He has been fired by Delta, and now he is under arrest. The Transportation Security Administration did report that they removed him immediately from the program after learning about his alleged crime. And they also took his equipment away. As of this moment, First Officer Dunn has not entered a plea agreement, and he's slated to be arraigned on November 16th. I'd be interested if anybody's commenting on this, what their thoughts are. We've seen some incidents in the past with Germanwings Flight 9525. Some of the things that are put in place in this case, locking the cockpit door, not being able to get in from the cabin. The first officer locked the pilot out and purposely crashed the aircraft into a mountainside, killing everybody on board. So some of these things, obviously, that are put in place, obviously that is to keep terrorists out from the back after 9/11, have the reverse effect. So it's interesting dialogue back and forth between, trusting, the humans that are in the front versus trusting humans in the back. Every kind of which way has its different flaws. Hard to find one system that secures everything completely. Even when you talk about autonomous flying, then you say, oh, well, we remove the humans from it. But as we've seen with other technologies, there's always that risk or thought of risk now. I mean, the technology is emerging that someone could hijack the electronics on an aircraft and use that in a way that maybe a human could have on the aircraft itself. So it's interesting as technology develops, there's always another way to attack such technology or human beings and their emotions. So it's an interesting conversation. Would be curious to know what listeners think about it. Feel free to drop me a line on it. Shoot it over to the email, dapodcast85@gmail.com. Or you can always post something to Instagram. We'll find you there. I do get some messages through the website, not a lot. When you're managing a website, you get a lot of spam or just people sending you weird stuff. That's how the internet works. The email is a good way to get in touch with me, or feel free to do something via Instagram. Or I do check the messages that come through the website. Sometimes there are some real ones in there, but generally speaking, they're robots. I don't know, people from Russian basements. And people that just want to send random photos. I guess that's a thing over the internet. Don't know why people choose to do that, but I guess more power to them. Doing a new podcast. Somebody had brought up to me, one of the people listening to the show, that we haven't done a lot of international episodes. And maybe it would make sense to branch out, especially, we have a lot of listeners from India now. Thank you. Shout out to listening to us. Remember to subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate it. If you get an opportunity to do that, it helps me continue to build the channel out. Obviously, no, I don't ask for much of the listeners here. I'm just appreciative that you're here and listening to it. The more you subscribe, the more it helps me get awareness on the channel. We do have a Google ad campaign going out there, and we're getting more and more listeners every episode. So I really appreciate everybody that tunes in and just takes some time out of your day to listen to me go through some of these. Aviation is my day job, and so getting a chance to interact with people that actually like aviation, like some of the stories in it, is really awesome for me. So thank you there. But back to the original point, the comment was made that we should maybe look a little more outside the United States and look at some accidents that happen internationally, which brings us to the episode for today, which is Yeti Airline Flight 691. It's very interesting, very dynamic. I think accident, obviously, in our world that we live in now, with everything basically being on camera, there were so many views of this, including if you haven't seen somebody that was inside the aircraft when it actually had its incident. So we'll get into our usual flow here with the details. I'm going to try to hammer this out here over the weekend. Recording this on a Saturday, the editing takes a bit of time to get everything kind of squared away on the editing side. I'm meeting with the Secretary of Transportation for the state of Illinois on Monday, so I will be down there for a meeting on that, talking about aviation and things that we're doing within the state. So looks like we're getting some movement on the federal side, legislative. We'll see. I heard that Speaker Mike Johnson said to Senate Leader Schumer, watch your back. So maybe that's just the start of dialogue to resolution on FAA reauthorization. So we'll find out from there. As usual, we'll get into the episode here. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on with this Yeti Airlines, with Nepal aviation in general. So thanks for being with us. So now that we're branching out international, we're seeing a lot of views from Asia. And so Nepal is actually located in South Asia. You know a little bit about what Nepal is for all of our listeners. Maybe we have some people listening from Nepal. It's mainly situated in the Himalayas. It has borders with Tibet, China, and India. India, we know, has been listening, so thank you, India, for listening to the podcast. Nepal has a diverse geography, pine forested hills, 8 of the world's 10 tallest mountains. You know, obviously we hear a lot about Mount Everest. I did not know 8 of the 10 resided in Nepal. Kathmandu is the nation's capital and the largest city. For those of you, as you know, I'm from Michigan. Our first episode was geared around Michigan. So we have a lot of famous people from Michigan. They're basically Axel Foley from Beverly Hills Cop, Kid Rock, and Bob Seger. I'm sure there's some other ones in there. But if anybody remembers Bob Seger, he was the rocker from 70s, 80s. My dad actually met Bob Seger at a radio station before Bob Seger got famous, and my father told him he would never amount to anything. So I guess in that case, my father was incorrect. But at the time, Bob Seger was playing, local joints, high school proms, basically everything that every band does before they get big, even to the Beatles. But Bob Seger had a song called Kathmandu, and it went a little something like this. When I'm going to Kathmandu, that's really what I want to do. And that was a horrible rendition, so I don't think I will get flagged, copyrighted on that from anybody. And I don't think anybody probably knows who Bob Seger is anymore anyways, so maybe they do. Maybe we got some Bob Seger fans out there. Feel free to send me a message. Actually, that's probably one of those weird messages I'll get to the website's message link. Be like, I know who Bob Seger is. But so Kathmandu is actually the departure point for our Yeti airline. We've heard of Yeti coolers. We've heard of Yeti mugs. Basically, anything that has Yeti on it stands for, I'm going to pay a lot more for this. It's funny. I had read a story, I think it was a year or so ago. There was Yeti coolers that fell off a cargo ship in the Pacific Ocean, and they were floating up to Alaska. And so there's actually some people in planes spotting for coolers that had washed up shore. The locals turned out in droves to go up and down the beach to try to find these Yeti coolers, and then started reselling them on eBay and whatnot. So kind of a cool story. I watched Family Guy. There was that scene with Quagmire in Cleveland where you talk more about the Yeti cooler than really enjoying the Yeti itself. So it's more of a lifestyle probably when you buy a Yeti. Everybody always brags about the Yetis. I mean, I like Yetis, but I feel like you get a Yeti and it's a good product. So when you have them as like the tumblers, how many Yetis do you really need? Now I say this all now, at some point down the road, I'll probably be selling Yetis with our Destination Aviation podcast logo on it. And everybody listening at this moment can come back and say, aha, I thought you didn't like them, Jeff. But Yeti Airlines is an airline based in Kathmandu in Nepal. The airline was established in May of 1998 and received its Air Operator Certificate on August 17th, 1998. Since 2019, Yeti Airlines is the first carbon-neutral airline in Nepal and South Asia. It has a parent company of Tara Air, and as of 2022, Yeti Airlines was the second largest domestic carrier in Nepal after Buddha Air. An interesting tidbit, in 2023, it was reported Asian Life Insurance would take over 49% stake of Yeti Airlines. I've never heard of an insurance company buying an airline, but maybe considering some of the accident records of the airline, they thought they could own them and maybe stop paying out less. I'm just saying that I don't think Asian Life Insurance was a part of this before any of the accidents, or they weren't their insurance broker. Their fleet consists of the ATR-72, which you haven't seen. It's really a workhorse of aviation, really robust, tough aircraft. When I worked in Laredo, Texas, we worked with now defunct Aeromar Airlines, which was predominantly a domestic carrier in Mexico, flying the ATR-72s predominantly. They had another version of the ATR as well. Nice aircraft, seat. I flew on it several times. They had these great ciabatta ham sandwiches, but the airline folded. There was that downgrade from the U.S. with Mexican carriers. They weren't able to maintain their service, and so they went out of business last year. So no more Aeromar Airlines, and that does leave a hole with regional domestic connection points within Mexico. But I could see where that aircraft would make a lot of sense for flying in the rugged terrain of Nepal. So the ATR-72s is all of their current fleet. It replaced several different forms of BAE Jetstream 41s, de Havillands, Dorniers over the years. A lot of those aircraft that you would expect to be flying in this kind of mountainous terrain. Yeti Airlines Flight 691. It was a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Kathmandu to Pokhara in Nepal. The flight took off from Kathmandu's International Airport at 10:33 a.m. The takeoff, climb, and cruise and descent to Pokhara was normal. During the first contact with Pokhara Tower, air traffic control assigned the runway 30 to land. But during a later phase of flight, crew requested and received clearance from ATC to land on runway 12. At 10:51 hours, the aircraft descended from 6,500 feet. At 10:56, the pilots extended the flaps to 15-degree position. At this point, they selected the landing gear to the down position. The takeoff setting was selected on the power management panel. The autopilot was disengaged at an altitude of 721 feet above ground level. Flaps were called out at 30 and descending. The flight data recorder did not record the flap surface movement at that time. Instead, the propeller rotation speed of both engines decreased, simultaneously less than 25%. So far, sounds like your normal approach to landing. On the cockpit voice recorder, an area microphone recording a single master caution chime was recorded at 10:56 and 36 seconds. The flight crew then carried out the performing landing checklist before starting the left turn onto base leg. During that time, the power level angle was increased from 41 to 44%. At that point, both propellers were recorded as non-computed data in the FDR, and torque of both engines were at 0. The propellers were feathered, and they were not producing thrust. So far it's sounding like the aircraft's configured to land, but the power settings don't seem to be matching what one would expect from a normal landing. At 10:56 and 50 seconds, when the radio altitude call out for 500 feet was enunciated, another click sound was heard. The aircraft reached a maximum bank angle of 30 degrees at this altitude. The first officer asked the captain whether to continue the descent, and the captain responded it was not necessary and instructed to apply a little power. At 10:56 and 54 seconds, another click was heard. followed by flap surface movement to 30-degree position. Air traffic control gave clearance to land at 10:57 and 7 seconds. The first officer mentioned twice that there were no power coming from the engines. At 10:57 and 11 seconds, power levers were advanced first to 62 degrees, then to a maximum power position. It was followed by a click sound at 10:57 and 16 seconds. 1 second after the click sound, the aircraft was at its last turn at 368 feet above ground level. It's noted that the first officer handed over control of the aircraft to the captain at 10:57 and 18 seconds. At 10:57 and 20 seconds, the first officer repeated again there was no power from the engines. At 10:57 and 24 seconds, when the aircraft was 311 feet above ground level, the stick shaker was activated, warning the crew that the aircraft angle of attack had increased up to the stick shaker threshold. So stick shaker, for those that don't know, coming in for landing in an aircraft like this type, if you're reaching a stall speed, the stick shaker actually shakes the controls that are in the pilot's hands to warn them that the aircraft is stalling. The type of aircraft that I fly, I don't have that, but obviously smaller aircraft, I mean, everybody's aptitude's a little bit different when they're flying, but it's easy to kind of keep track of airspeed versus your approach speeds, what you need when you're coming in, those type of things. But in the larger aircraft, of course, sometimes disorientation. This helps to at least give the pilots a physical warning into their hands that something is going wrong with the approach or flight, whatever version of flight they're in at that point, that the aircraft is reaching a critical stall speed. At 10:57 and 26 seconds, a second sequence of stick shaker warnings was activated when the aircraft banked towards the left abruptly. Thereafter, the radio altitude alert for 200 feet was enunciated, and the cricket sound and stick shaker ceased. At 10:57 and 32 seconds, sound of impact was heard in the CVR. The FDR and the CVR stopped recording at 10:57, 33 seconds, and 10:57 and 35 seconds. There is video of an individual who's in the back of the aircraft while they're coming into approach, and you see this video, they're videoing from out the left side of the aircraft, and you can see what appears to just be a classic stall of the left wing, and then it banked violently towards the left and into the ground. The video camera, actually, there's a lot of fire, a lot of debris, but the camera continues to roll after impact. All you see is kind of rubble. When you see where this aircraft impacted as it was landing, it went into a densely populated area. So there was a lot of buildings on the ground, and you have video from inside the aircraft and video from community members of showing this aircraft what appears to be a classical stall. When you're pilot training, power on, power off stalls, all of those are practiced at high altitudes. The lift that's created on the wings is what actually keeps the aircraft moving forward. So power is propelling the aircraft, but if you stall the aircraft, that's where now you end up in a situation where you can go into a spin, have one wing stalling over the other. So when you're practicing them at higher altitude, right? Everybody's a little bit different, but say you go up to 3,000 feet or 5,000 feet, you do a power on, power off stall, and you create this environment. Well, as we can see from the ground level, they're very close to the ground, they're on approach. The idea is you practice these so you know as a pilot when you're getting into that situation how to get out of it before the aircraft stalls, and especially in this case where it stalls, you lose altitude, you don't have the ability to recover. So you practice them at a higher altitude, so when you eventually find yourself coming into an airport, you can recognize the characteristics that come along a stall and put yourself into an environment, one, where it doesn't happen, but if you see that it's happening, you know how to get out of it. Unfortunately, once the aircraft stalls, if you're stalling landing at an airport, which many times you see this type of activity, whether it's something like this where we'll get a little more of the details, but maybe it looks like it's leaning towards pilot error, sometimes in icing conditions, right, that changes the design of the wing. And so now you have a higher stall component. Maybe your flaps aren't working. I've seen that before. I was actually working in an airport where FedEx was coming in and they lost the ability to use their flaps. So when you put your flaps down, right, you're creating more wings so you could come in at a slower speed. So in reality, what happened there, it wasn't the end of the world, but FedEx came in at a much higher approach speed than they normally do. We did have the fire trucks out there waiting just in case you're coming in at a higher speed. There's potential more ability that the aircraft's going to go off the end of the runway. But in that case, everything was fine. So you can see a lot of these characteristics, but at the end of the day, stalling an aircraft is one of those kind of basic components all pilots start to learn when they just first get their private pilot's license. It's one of the first things you do out the door. When you do your check rides, when you're going back, that's usually a critical component. The flight instructors want to see that you still have the ability to, one, recognize a stall and then get yourself out of that if that's happening. So it's best to practice that when you're higher up in the sky versus when you're down low trying to land like this aircraft. So the crash occurred in the Gandaki province between the old Pakar Airport and the new Pakar International Airport. Interesting enough, the new airport had just opened right before this crash happened. The crash into the ground resulted in the deaths of all 72 people on board. It was Nepal's worst aviation accident since the crash of the Pakistani International Airlines Flight 268 in 1992. The deadliest aviation accident in domestic aviation Nepal flying. So the weather was clear. The preliminary report of cause was the technical issue of the plane. The ATR 72-500 was a 15-year-old turboprop twin-engine aircraft. The registration item was 9 November Alpha November Charlie. It was first delivered to the Kingfisher Airlines in 2007, transferred in 2013 to Nok Air, and then delivered to Yeti Airlines in 2019. It's interesting, we haven't covered this in here before, but some other aviation accident, there was a China Airlines flight that crashed and the tail actually ripped off the plane. What happened in that incident was a 747. Nobody knew. They thought maybe it was a bomb, whatever. How could an aircraft do this? It actually had a tail strike from previous owners. And the maintenance job was not done to standard. And over time, so over like 20 years, it resulted in this aircraft disintegrating. Not necessarily saying anything in this case that that's what happened here. It's always interesting to me who owned the aircraft, where it was delivered, and especially those AMPs of those aviation maintenance mechanics, very heavily scrutinized in the repairs that they're doing to these aircraft, because sometimes these repairs can go on for decades before maybe they cause an actual incident. So then investigators are digging well deep into these maintenance logs. Of the 72 people on board, 68 passengers and 4 were crew members. One of the sadder parts about this accident was the plane was under command of Senior Captain Kamal, with Anju Katawada as a co-pilot. Katawada's husband, Deepak, worked for Yeti Airlines, and he died in a 2006 Yeti Airlines Twin Otter crash. Kawada was set to qualify as a captain upon successful completion of this flight. So just crazy to think your husband dies in a plane crash in 2006 for the same airline. You start working for them on this final flight that you have. You were going from first officer to captain, and you perish in it. It's just the coincidences are just, in this case, sad. Just briefly touch on this because it is, I think, one of those parts of the story that it's such, a connection point for the flight crew. So on June 21st, 2006, when approaching the Jamala Airport in Nepal, Yeti Airlines de Havilland 6 Twin Otter crashed into the ground after the crew decided to abort the landing and perform a go-around for an unknown reason. Eyewitnesses said that the plane appeared to have stalled while making a right turn on the threshold of runway 27 and plowed into the ground into a ball of fire on the eastern edge of the runway. So after the death of her husband, Pakura's wife, Anju, wanted to get into aviation. There was, I think, a connection from what I'm reading here for her to maybe be close to her husband. The similarities of the accidents between this aircraft and Yeti Airlines Flight 691 really could, if you were making a movie, this is how this would all line up. It's insane. I mean, it'd be a sad movie, obviously, but it's insane to think that all of this just randomly attached itself to each other.
So let's get back to Yeti Flight 691.
So the airport was closed. They launched a rescue operation. As we talked about, this crash into the city close to the airport. The government of Nepal summoned an emergency cabinet meeting following the crash. The Prime Minister said he was deeply saddened by the accident, and it was declared that January 16th to be a national day of mourning for Nepal, and the flags flown at half-staff. So through the investigation, experts noted that the video from the ground taken moments before the crash showed the aircraft's nose noticeably high before the left wing suddenly dropped, probably indicating a stall, as we talked about earlier. Hours after the crash, a 5-member committee was set up to investigate the accident in conjunction with the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis of Civil Aviation. On January 16th, the flight data and cockpit voice recorders were found. We talked a little bit about what those were reported earlier. The aircraft's propellers had been feathered for a minute prior to the crash, causing the engine to produce no thrust and led the vehicle into a stall. The condition levers, which control the propellers, were discovered from the wreckage set to be in feathered position. Seconds preceding the crash, the pilots discussed a total lack of power and even moved power lever to the extreme, but failed to recognize that the condition levers were wrongly set. The condition levers and flap lever are next to each other in the ATR-72. Experts speculate that monitoring pilot Kamal had inadvertently moved the former to place of the latter. When asked of by the flying pilot why about 20 seconds later he would set the flap lever properly on his own, he failed to account for the previous mistake, implying that the landing checklist was not properly followed. The master caution chime was likely alerting the loss of AC Wild propeller-driven generators and associated systems powered by the AC Wild electric system. This is primarily the hydraulic pumps, ice protection system, and some interior and exterior lights when the propellers are feathered. The flight path was changed to runway 12 because this and another aircraft were not meeting the 500 feet above ground level on the configuration that the pilots received when this crash happened. As we talked about, the airport was relatively new, opening January 1st, and our accident happened on January 15th. So you really have from the opening day to this 14 days that the airport was in operation. So this accident is still fairly new. No final report has been published yet, so we'll obviously leave any speculation to the final report. If we see one of those come out, maybe we'll just add something to one of our future podcasts. But from what we can tell, it appears that there were some inconsistencies in the landing configuration that's normal for the ATR-72. As we talked about, landing and taking off are critical phases of flight, and stalling is obviously the main component why they are so critical. Overall, we started the podcast with talking about accidents that happen in the Himalayan nation of Nepal. Obviously, climate, weather, low visibility, and mountainous topography all contribute to Nepal's reputation of a notoriously dangerous place to fly. So obviously the terrain can be difficult to navigate from the air, particularly during bad weather, and things are made worse by the need to use small aircraft to access more remote and mountainous parts of the country. Aircraft with 19 seats or fewer are more likely to have accidents due to these challenges, the Civil Aviation Authority reported. The capital of Kathmandu is Nepal's primary transit hub, from which many of these smaller flights leave. So similar to probably hub and spoke in the United States, larger airport like Chicago O'Hare taking smaller flights to an airport like Quad Cities, probably similar to that. But in many of how the United States airports are developed, that's on demand, right? So smaller airports where the demand's less. Here, there's probably obviously population base that's less, but in reality, you probably can't build larger airports in a lot of the terrain. Speaking of that, the airport town of Lukla in northwestern Nepal is often referred to as the world's most dangerous airport, known as the Gateway to Everest. The airport's runway is laid out on a cliffside between mountains, dropping straight into the abyss at the end. If you haven't seen any of the takeoffs from this airport, I highly recommend going and looking at them. Sometimes you'll see an aircraft leave, dip down into the canyon, and then pop back up on departure. So it's crazy to see that. A lack of investment in aging aircraft adds to the risk of flying. In 2015, the International Civil Aviation Organization of the United Nations prioritized helping Nepal through its Aviation Safety Implementation Assistance Partnership. 2 years later, ICAO and Nepal announced a partnership to resolve any safety concerns. So the country has made many safety improvements in recent years, but challenges still remain. In 2016, Tara flight crashed while flying the same route as our Yeti Airline Flight 691. That was a twin-outer flying in clear conditions. In 2018, U.S. Bengal Airlines flight from Dhaka to Kathmandu crashed while landing and caught fire, killing 51 of 71 people on board. And in May of 2022, Tara flight with 22 people on board crashed into a mountainside of 14,500 feet. So dangerous terrain. But as we talk about other aviation systems, right, I think that ICAO, one is the International Civil Aviation Organization, has a set standard most of the countries around the world tried to follow. It was very interesting for me as well to look at another aviation system from the time that I've spent in the United States. That's predominantly my background. I did work, obviously, as I've talked about, with Mexico a lot when I was in southern Texas, and so I know a little bit about their system. One, thank you to our listeners out there. I'm hoping that this regional episode to kind of Asia, to India, there is an opening not only for the listeners, but for me as well to learn a little bit more about other cultures and their aviation systems. And I got to say, just the beauty of the country that I was able to see through the research of this. You know, obviously we hear about Mount Everest. There's a lot of conversation around Mount Everest. It's mainstream, we know it, but a lot of these things I didn't. I'll be honest, I didn't know where Kathmandu was. I didn't know what Bob Seger was singing about. I thought maybe it was some obscure spot outside Detroit, maybe in the thumb of Michigan. But no, I mean, in reality, I thought maybe Kathmandu was Russia or something. I didn't know it was in Nepal. So I learn a lot from doing this podcast as well. I hope you're enjoying it. Most of the comments I get in, people seem to like it. Like I said, this is not written in stone. I'm always open to ideas and suggestions. I actually just got another one in today, so I try to employ a little bit of that as I go through this. Thank you for sharing your time with us today as we move into fall, as we move into November. We're going to continue getting these podcasts out, communicating with you guys, hopefully get some more plain tales in there. So please remember to shoot me a line at dapodcast85@gmail.com if you want to communicate on things. If you're interested in purchasing a sticker, we do have them on the websites. They're $5. I'll mail them to you. You can stick it on whatever you like. Or if you don't like somebody, you could stick it on their stuff. Either way, it's advertising. The stickers came out really good. I hope people like them. Giving out a lot of them so far. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning back in. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. And until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway.